The word asylum once meant refuge, a sanctuary for those society cast aside. In an age when the mentally ill were thrown into filthy jails or left to rot in almshouses, these institutions seemed like a beacon of compassion. But behind their noble facade lurked a reality of cruelty, neglect, and pseudo-scientific horrors. This video uncovers the shocking truth of how a hopeful vision of care collapsed into abuse, exposing 10 of the darkest secrets that turned sanctuaries into nightmares. Number 10. We uncover one of the most infamous beginnings in the history of mental health care: the chilling transformation of the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, later notorious as Bedlam. Founded in 1247 in London as a religious priory meant for spiritual healing, its original mission was rooted in compassion. Yet over the centuries, what started as a sanctuary spiraled into a house of exploitation and cruelty. By the 18th century, Bedlam was no longer a hidden institution, it became a macabre tourist attraction. For a penny, curious visitors could enter and witness the suffering of the mentally ill as if they were part of a grotesque carnival. Patients were confined in cages, often stripped naked, their dignity stripped away alongside their clothing. Crowds didn't just observe, they interacted, jeering, taunting, and even poking the inmates to provoke wild reactions. The misery of the vulnerable became entertainment, and the institution itself profited from this human zoo. Rather than dedicating resources to treatment or recovery, the asylum's financial survival was tied to perpetuating despair and chaos, ensuring that the public had something shocking to watch. This perverse business model set a dark precedent where the well-being of patients was secondary to profit and spectacle. What should have been a beacon of care became the archetype of cruelty, casting a long shadow over centuries of psychiatric history. The story of Bedlam's descent is a haunting reminder that even noble beginnings can be corrupted when humanity is sacrificed for money and amusement. Sliding into number 9, we step inside the hidden world of early psychiatric institutions, where the most common treatment was not therapy, but physical restraint. Despite reformers in the 18th and 19th centuries advocating for the philosophy of non-restraint, the grim reality was that most asylums ran on a system of chains, shackles, and straitjackets. The first American mental health ward opened in 1752 at Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Hospital. Starkly illustrates this approach with iron restraints bolted to the walls. Patients were not viewed as individuals in need of care, but as danger bodies that needed controlling. Underfunding and chronic understaffing meant attendants had neither the training nor the time to provide humane interaction, so brute force became the default. The use of restraints wasn't just physically damaging, but psychologically devastating, stripping away any sense of autonomy or humanity. Tragically, there are documented cases where restraint turned deadly, such as the story of William Scrivenger, who suffocated after being left overnight in a straitjacket. Rather than being isolated incidents, such deaths highlighted the dangers of a system built on containment rather than compassion. The practice created a vicious cycle. Patients became more agitated when restrained, attendants responded with greater force, and the asylum environment descended further into chaos. Behind closed doors, these dungeons of despair masked themselves as medical institutions, but their reality was closer to prisons. This reliance on restraint exposes the early asylum system's true function, not to heal, but to confine and control, reinforcing the grim truth that mental health care at the time was more about custody than cure. At number 8, we dive into one of the most chilling so-called treatments in asylum history: hydrotherapy, a practice that blurred the line between medical care and torture. By the early 20th century, doctors promoted water-based treatments as a way to either calm or shock patients into mental stability. Patients could be submerged in warm baths for hours, even days, under the belief that the water would soothe their disturbed minds. Others were subjected to freezing cold plunges intended to jolt them into sanity. Far from therapeutic, these methods often caused hypothermia, skin damage, and severe trauma. Some asylums even locked patients into specially designed tubs, sealing them in so they could not escape the prolonged ordeal. Yet what unfolded in a Jamaican asylum during the 19th century took this cruelty to horrifying extremes, known as tanking. Patients were forcibly held underwater until they nearly drowned, all under the guise of discipline. A government inquiry in 1861 condemned this as a most cruel and revolting crime, exposing how several deaths were directly linked to the practice. The disturbing reality was that punishment was being rebranded as treatment, with medical language twisted to justify barbarity. Hydrotherapy reveals a dark truth about early psychiatric history. Institutions often experimented on vulnerable patients with little concern for their safety, turning supposed medical innovations into tools of control. These watery nightmares were less about healing and more about enforcing submission, a reminder of how easily medicine can be manipulated into a mask for torture when human dignity is ignored. At number 7, we enter the true nightmare of asylum life. Not the treatments or restraints, but the unchecked cruelty of those entrusted with patient care. Early institutions, chronically underfunded and bursting with overcrowded wards, created a breeding ground for neglect and brutality. The state's penny-pinching left asylums staffed by poorly trained, underpaid attendants, often men and women with little medical knowledge or worse, serious personal issues. Reports from the mid-20th century describe doctors who were incompetents, alcoholics, and psychotics, individuals wholly unfit for the responsibility of caring for the vulnerable. One governor of New York chillingly admitted that our cows in the hospital barns get better care than the men and women in the wards. This wasn't exaggeration. Records document scores of patient deaths following savage beatings at the hands of attendants, with hundreds more assaults just shy of homicide. Patients were slapped, punched, kicked, and even clubbed into submission, their suffering hidden behind asylum walls. The infamous inscription, "George was killed here 1937," scrawled on a dungeon wall became a ghostly reminder of lives crushed by sanctioned violence. This wasn't random cruelty. It was the predictable outcome of a system that prioritized order over care and provided no accountability. The vulnerable, abandoned by their families and forgotten by society, became easy prey for abuse in an institution designed more like a prison than a hospital. These houses of horrors stand as some of the darkest chapters in psychiatric history, proof that systemic neglect breeds cruelty when oversight and compassion are stripped away. Coming in at number 6, we confront one of the most infamous medical disasters in psychiatric history, the rise of the lobotomy. In the 1930s, Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz pioneered the idea that mental illness could be treated by severing brain connections, winning him a Nobel Prize. His radical surgery sparked worldwide enthusiasm, but it was in the United States that the procedure took its most grotesque form. American physician Walter Freeman revolutionized lobotomy into a crude, lightning-fast operation known as the transorbital or ice pick lobotomy. Using an actual ice pick-like instrument, Freeman would push through a patient's eye socket, hammer it into the brain, and sever frontal lobe connections, all in a matter of minutes, often without surgical theaters or sterile conditions. To Freeman, this was progress, and he performed thousands of lobotomies across America, sometimes conducting 20 or more in a single day. The reality, however, was catastrophic. Patients frequently emerged docile but stripped of their personalities, creativity, and intellectual function. For some, the procedure caused seizures, incontinence, or death. For others, it reduced vibrant individuals to childlike shells of themselves. Rather than curing illness, lobotomy obliterated identity, creating lives of dependency and silence. Freeman himself traveled the country in a van he called his lobotomobile, spreading the practice like a gruesome roadshow. The downfall of the lobotomy came not from ethical outrage, but from the arrival of antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine, which offer a safer, more effective alternative. Yet the legacy of the ice pick lobotomy remains a chilling testament to the desperation and recklessness of psychiatry's past, an era where human lives were sacrificed on the altar of experimentation. At number 5, we expose another bizarre and dangerous chapter in asylum history, the era of insulin coma therapy and chemically induced convulsions. In the 1930s, Austrian psychiatrist Manfred Sakel introduced a radical treatment, injecting patients with massive doses of insulin to push them into deep daily comas. These insulin wings soon became fixtures in psychiatric hospitals, where patients endured weeks or even months of repeated unconsciousness in the hope of shocking the brain into normalcy. Around the same time, metrazole therapy took hold, using chemical injections to induce violent seizures that left patients writhing uncontrollably. Advocates hailed these procedures as breakthroughs, branding them landmarks in psychiatric progress. But behind the veneer of medical advancement lay untold suffering. Insulin comas frequently resulted in irreversible brain damage or death, with some patients never waking up. Survivors often reported lasting trauma, with mathematician John Nash later depicted in A Beautiful Mind, describing the therapy as torture that erased large portions of his memory. For doctors, however, the therapy was seductive. It required specialized wards, more staff, and constant attention, making it appear that patients improved simply because they finally received structured, humane care in a supportive environment. The grim truth, revealed later, was that the supposed cure came not from the insulin or seizures, but from the rare glimpse of compassion and order these elite wings provided. Once antipsychotic medications emerged, insulin and metrazole were abandoned, exposed as both dangerous and scientifically baseless. This poisoned needle era highlights psychiatry's desperate embrace of extreme measures, where risky experiments masqueraded as hope, while the true healing element, dignity and empathy, remained overlooked. At number 4, we step into one of the darkest corners of early psychiatry, where the operating room became a butcher shop disguised as treatment. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, alienists, early psychiatrists, embraced a dangerous belief known as the somaticist view. The idea that mental illness stemmed from hidden infections or defects within the body. This misguided theory gave rise to a wave of experimental surgeries that left thousands mutilated in the name of science. No figure embodies this grotesque chapter more than Dr. Henry Cotton, superintendent of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. Convinced that bacteria lurking in the body caused madness, Cotton routinely ordered the removal of teeth, tonsils, stomachs, gallbladders, uteruses, ovaries, and even spleens from his patients. He boasted of miraculous cure rates, but the reality was horrifying. Mortality soared, patients died from sepsis, and survivors were left disfigured and broken. What made this even more chilling was the air of legitimacy. These surgeries were celebrated in medical journals and funded by public institutions, blurring the line between healing and harm. This dangerous overconfidence treated patients as disposable test subjects, their bodies reduced to parts in a misguided mechanical repair. Instead of restoring sanity, these invasive operations robbed countless people of health, dignity, and often life itself. The medical butcher shop era remains one of psychiatry's most haunting scandals, a grim warning of how unchecked authority and pseudoscience can turn hospitals into places of torment under the illusion of progress. At number 3, we uncover the primitive foundations upon which early psychiatric care was built, ancient medical theories that turned asylums into chambers of ritualized suffering. Long before modern neuroscience, doctors clung to the humoral theory, a belief inherited from ancient Greece that claimed human behavior was dictated by 4 bodily fluids: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Mental illness under this framework was simply an imbalance to be purged by force. This archaic worldview justified a litany of brutal treatments. Patients deemed overheated were bled until they collapsed, often losing pints of blood in a single session. Others were given emetics or purgatives designed to violently empty the body, leaving them weak, dehydrated, and humiliated. Hydrotherapy, too, was framed within this context. Icy plunges to jolt the melancholic, warm baths to pacify the phlegmatic. Even revered physicians like Benjamin Rush, often hailed as the father of American psychiatry, championed these methods, firmly convinced that bleeding and purging were the surest paths to sanity. In truth, these therapies were acts of desperation, clinging to outdated dogma while patients suffered endlessly. The so-called science provided a veneer of order, but the results were often fatal or left patients in worse condition than before. The persistence of these practices, centuries after their inefficacy was clear, reveals a tragic refusal to embrace compassion or genuine innovation. Instead of listening to the complexities of the mind, early doctors sought to force the body into submission, transforming asylums into arenas of suffering justified by pseudoscience. This barbaric chapter underscores how misguided theory can perpetuate cruelty when human dignity is sacrificed in the pursuit of control. At number 2, we expose the crushing weight of overcrowding, the economic engine that transformed asylums into vast human warehouses. What began as institutions designed to heal quickly became overwhelmed dumping grounds, absorbing not only the mentally ill, but also the poor, the elderly, and the socially unwanted. By the late 19th century, local governments eager to cut costs redefined social issues like homelessness, poverty, and senility as psychiatric disorders, offloading vulnerable populations into already strained hospitals. the numbers ballooned at a staggering rate. By the mid-20th century, state asylums in the United States housed more than 500,000 people, often at twice their intended capacity. Eyewitness accounts describe wards so crowded that the floors cannot be seen between the rickety cots, with patients packed side by side or left to sleep on bare, filthy floors. In such conditions, the lofty promises of moral treatment collapsed entirely. Attendants, already underpaid and undertrained, resorted to crude measures, heavy restraints, sedation, and violence to manage the overwhelming tide of patients. Genuine therapy was impossible. Survival was the only goal. Vestiaires. Stripped of dignity, patients became numbers in a ledger. Evidence of Assisi asylums became little more than holding pens, where society stored its unwanted out of sight, severed from their families, and futem, driven by economics rather than humanity. The image of overcrowded dormitories filled with silent, neglected souls captures the true horror of this era, not deliberate cruelty alone, but a systemic indifference that allowed entire generations to be warehoused and forgotten. Finally, at number 1, we confront the most insidious legacy of the asylum era: the systematic erasure of the patient's voice. While the history of mental institutions is filled with stories of doctors, reformers, and administrators, the voices of those who lived and suffered inside were silenced at every turn. Letters written by patients, pleas for freedom, accounts of abuse, or simple messages to loved ones were routinely confiscated, never delivered. These writings were dismissed as mad letters and tucked into medical charts with cold annotations like delusional or paranoid. By stripping patients of their ability to communicate, institutions controlled the narrative, ensuring that public records reflected only a sanitized, official version of events. This censorship went beyond individual cruelty. It was a deliberate act of narrative control, erasing first-hand testimonies that could have exposed systemic abuse. Privacy laws and institutional secrecy further buried these personal accounts, sealing away the truth for generations. In this silence, the horrors of beatings, mutilations, starvation, and neglect persisted unchecked, protected by a system that refused to recognize its victims as credible witnesses. The absence of patient testimony is the ultimate darkness, because it allowed all other abuses to thrive in the shadows. By silencing the very people they were meant to help, asylums not only destroyed lives but also robbed history at its most vital perspective: the lived reality of the confined. The silence of the mad is a haunting reminder that the deepest cruelty is not always what is done to the body, but what is stolen from the soul: the right to be heard, remembered, and believed. Amidst the horrors, reformers like William Tuke, Philippe Pinel, and Dorothea Dix proved that compassion was always possible, that cruelty was a choice, not a necessity. Though the age of asylums ended with deinstitutionalization, their shadow still lingers in underfunded systems, stigma, and neglect. The greatest lesson is clear: true progress lies not in quick fixes, but in dignity, empathy, and refusing to repeat the past. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe. And subscribe for more content on the darkest chapters of history.